One. Hi. My name is Aramo Shayedi. I'm a curator here at the Hammer, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program with art historians Thomas Crow and Stephen Nelson. Presented in conjunction with Stories of Almost Everyone, the exhibition currently on view in the galleries upstairs. Tonight's program was prompted by the publication of Crow's recent No Idols, The Missing Theology of Art, a book that was suggested to me by curator Linda Norden in the early stages of planning this exhibition. Linda made sure that I consult No Idols in order to help understand my own interest in ideas of belief and faith as they relate to a legacy of conceptual art. From the outset, I imagined that the exhibition for the Hammer would have to reconcile these factors, would have to come to terms with what could be a transition from an art predicated on the primacy of ideas to an art predicated on a system of belief, or more appropriately, an art that stealthily has returned us to a system of belief. But because there is no honor system in art, no requirement to be truthful, honest, or otherwise, there is a term that is equally germane to the discussion, and that term is skepticism. The general public, as we already know, has tended to be rightfully suspicious of artists, curators, and institutions of art, but it could be argued that critical debates within art are often fueled by a similar brand of skepticism, or rather a doubt in an object's ability to convey the narratives, histories, and so forth that it has been tasked with conveying. If exchanges between art objects and their receivers are predicated on faith on the one hand or doubt on the other, then the accumulation of knowledge in the context of an exhibition runs the simultaneous risk of being unorthodox or faulty. Tonight, before being joined on stage by Stephen, Tom Crow will speak on the topics explored in No Idols, a study on the persistence of religious tendencies within art history despite an unwillingness to recognize them as such. Admittedly, the relevance to the exhibition upstairs is fairly askew. His writings for this volume find a latent religiosity within otherwise secular forms and within the context of a secular discourse. Crow's research for No Idols is focused on individual artists like Colin McCahon, Mark Rothko, James Turrell, Robert Smithson, and Sister Corita Kent. And these names in some ways bear few similarities to those names included in Stories of Almost Everyone, though perhaps there are traces of magic, spiritualism, the unseen, or the otherworldly that connect one to the other. And it would be misleading of me to not acknowledge the fact that Tom Crow has been responsible for shaping this exhibition in other, perhaps imperceptible ways. As a graduate student in art history, I had the great pleasure of taking part in a number of seminars that he taught amidst his responsibilities as the director of the Getty Research Institute. His essay, Unwritten Histories of Conceptual Art Against Visual Culture, has remained an invaluable touchstone in my own thinking around the generational narrative of art history. Crow begins this formative essay, quote, "Almost every work of serious contemporary art recapitulates on some explicit or implicit level the historical sequence of objects to which it belongs," end quote. A number of artists included in Stories of Almost Everyone remain perplexed and motivated by this truth, indebted as they are to the modes of thinking and practices that have shaped the present moment and their own relationship to figures like Martha Rosler and Michael Asher, whose works impart themselves onto contemporary artistic thinking. I would also be remiss if I did not evoke Crow's own methodological study of intelligibility and interpretation in the now canonized book, The Intelligence of Art, where he writes, and forgive me for this somewhat long quote, "Faced with a mute work of art, any interested observer enters into a process of translation, making sense of it by some form of paraphrase in thought or words. No one assumes any such substitution to be adequate to the original object in need of explanation. Rather, the purpose of the exercise is to offer a vantage point from which salient aspects of the object can be mapped." It is through ideas such as these that Crow has influenced the thinking behind this exhibition, which I take to be something of an art historical exploration or a museological thought experiment disguised by recent art objects and the problems of interpretation and meaning that they evoke. So for the biographical information that you are all dying to hear, Thomas Crow is a Rosalie Salo Professor of Modern Art at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. He has written 2 influential studies of 18th century French painting, painters, and public life in 18th century Paris, and Emulation, Making Artists for Revolutionary France. Subsequent publications, including The Rise of the 60s American and European Art in the Era of Dissent, and the essay collection Modern Art in the Common Culture, examine the later 20th century, while The Intelligence of Art analyzes specific moments in art history as a discipline. His recent book, The Long March of Pop, Art, Music, and Design, 1930 to 1995, was published in 2015. In the same year, he delivered the Andrew Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., on the ways that the fall of Napoleon changed European art. In 2017, he gave the Paul Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery, London, under the title Searching for the Young Soul Rebels, Style, Music, and Art in London, 1956 to 1969. Crow is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a contributing editor at Art Forum. And following his presentation, he will be joined on stage by Stephen Nelson, the director of the African Studies Center and professor of African and African American art history at the University of California, Los Angeles. Nelson is also treasurer of the National Committee for the History of Art, as well as a former editor of African Arts and former book reviews editor of Art Journal and the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. In addition to his award-winning book From Cameroon to Paris, Moscow, Architecture in and Out of Africa, 2007, published in 2007. He has published widely on the arts, architecture, and urbanism of Africa and its diasporas, African American art history, and queer studies. Professor Nelson has received fellowships from the Getty Research Institute and Harvard University. He is currently completing 2 books titled On the Underground Railroad and Structural Adjustment, Mapping Geography and the Visual Cultures of Blackness. Tonight's lecture and conversation is part of a series of other public programs related to the exhibition upstairs. Please check the calendar for more events, including a screening of film and video works by artists in the exhibition on February 15th, a reading of Ghost Stories by artist Charles Ray on March 13th, a conversation between writer Lynn Tillman and artist Stephen Prina on the occasion of Tillman's very new publication, Men and Apparitions, on March 15th, as well as guided walkthroughs of the exhibition by Gary Dauphin, Sarah Lara Graywar, Saloni Mather, Marla Burns, and Aria Dean. I'd like to thank Tom and Stephen for being part of tonight's program and for contributing their ideas to the context that surrounds stories of almost everyone. Copies of No Idols will be available for sale immediately following the conversation in the lobby just outside of the theater, and hopefully we can persuade Tom to sign copies for the devotees of art history, for those loyal, groupies of Tom's. And with that, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones and refrain from using any other light-emitting devices. And I'll turn the stage over to Tom Crow. Thank you.
Hi. Aram, well, first of all, congratulations to you and the Hammer for the fantastic exhibition, which is, great for me in that, you've seen something in what I had to say that helped you do it, though I wouldn't claim very much personally. And I'm hugely glad to be back here. This UCLA is my graduate alma mater, and I don't get back here enough. And it brings back, lots of fantastic memories. I want to thank also Claudia and Jenny for all their help in organizing my visit. And the chance to talk about No Idols, which is, and I've done, several books, but this one is a little bit distinct. A kind of unusual book, a sort of parsimonious thing, small and plain, matte paper, narrow margins, published in Sydney, Australia, and bearing the series title Power Polemics. Now that arises from an initiative from the Power Institute at the University of Sydney, which is historically really the core of Australian art history, and it has a very distinguished legacy as a collecting and publishing and research sponsoring institution, if not so well known in this country. They had the idea that their publishing arm should launch a series of short books based on some pressing issue anywhere in the culture. Hence the format, compact, unadorned, plain paper, and for me, plain speech about a subject presumed to need no flashy embellishment. The director of the Power, Mark Ledbury, happens to be a former doctoral student of mine from the University of Sussex. And so I was very much predisposed to say yes when asked to do the first one in the series. But, the question immediately arose, God, I've got to sit down and write a book. What is it going to be about that would be suitably polemical and worth writing? In that so many controversial issues in art history or in the humanities in general have become, in a way, sort of petrified, perpetual, never really designed to be resolved, but serve instead to enable signaling this or that group affiliation. So I wouldn't have taken it on if it meant falling into that particular trap. I had to identify a polemic that I thought nobody would see coming. And theology seemed to be the answer to that question, as a topic that wouldn't map onto any of the currently active allegiances, but one that addressed an unthinking general presumption of materialist rationality being all there is, that assumption being one factor in the irresolvability of so many of these questions. And the opportunity was bolstered by the fact that I had developed some convictions already about the unacknowledged importance of the subject. One had arisen out of my teaching at the Institute in the art of later 17th century France, which is to say a moment of heated religious conflict, religious crisis indeed, involving some of the best minds in Europe. And we would just have to say the name of the great mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal, who was at the center of them. It seemed in our seminar increasingly misguided to continue assessing the conviction of such actors with no acknowledgement that their fundamental motivation to imagine a life redeemed from vain self-interest and idolatrous public hypocrisy included and implicated us as much as it did them. That it was not just some artifact of the period to be diagnosed at a comfortable and clinical distance. When devoting ourselves to charting their arguments and their meditations, how could we honestly exempt ourselves from asking the same intellectual and moral questions? Now, it has to be said that the worldwide surge of extreme fundamentalisms has made the separation of theology from barbarism impossible for too many thinking people. But nothing I had in mind presupposed the least doctrinal allegiance, or else it would not have worked. At a minimum, I thought we just needed a better sense of what it would be like to think in the way that our historical subjects did, and never condescend to them from a position of presumed greater enlightenment. Historical investigation, thus, required a shadowing by a parallel theological pursuit of our own, which also could never assume the substitution of aesthetic satisfactions for devotional regard. Never assume that the trick that has been done by modern viewers looking back at religious art as we transpose it into an aesthetic register and think that absolves you of any traffic with the idolatrous. It's now commonplace to assume that the European Renaissance stands as some great historical watershed whereby cult images venerated for their lineage into some true image of Christ, Mary, or a saint somehow gave way to the precedence of their artistic value. Painted reimaginings of those same figures, but in imaginative narrative environments. That valid historical observation lies behind laments over art's loss of its aura, meaning the cult-derived charisma of works, giving way to some detached exhibition value, followed by the boundless reproduction of works of art in the modern mass media. Now, the idolatrous nature of miracle-working true images is obvious, but the transposition of religious value into apparently disinterested aesthetic admiration leaves the spectator in a likewise submissive position before a merely material object. The fealty of the image supplicant survives within the modern viewer's self-exemption from supernaturalist belief. We can't discount the worthiness of the great monuments of Christian art as objects of study and contemplation and thought, but cautions are always in order against the vanity and ostentation bound up with their customary forms of display. Recoil from such tendencies motivated a good deal of the conceptual art from the 1960s onwards, the theme that Aram sounded at the start. Its renowned de-skilling in visual presentation, the scraps of typescript and artless-looking photographs, nonetheless conjured by implication the most sumptuously gilt-framed treasures. All iconoclasts share with their adversaries an overvaluing of merely material artifacts. And for that reason, the efforts of the de-skilled conceptualists don't figure in No Idols. Its mainly modern roster of artist subjects, Rothko, Smithson, McCahon, Turrell, Corita, abstained from the aggressively secularized attitudes common among their contemporaries, instead assuming the inseparability of the Western art tradition, like it or not, from its founding in Christian observance. Their number is small, but their collective stature, I think, is more than sufficient to authorize this theologically directed inquiry. As visual art appears the creative medium most predisposed to attract idolatry, so it would follow that escape from that trap by such figures as these would represent the more profound achievement compared with works in less material media. Now that was kind of one strand that I called upon in thinking about how this book would make sense to do. The other main source came straight from Los Angeles. To start with, I was compelled to rethink Robert Smithson in an essay for the great MoCA retrospective organized by Eugenie Tsai and Paul Schimmel. And suddenly inescapable in doing that was the recognition of Smithson as his own fiercely committed theologian, who saw through the pretensions of his minimalist contemporaries to instantiate the thing itself. And that awareness fueled his impatience with his impatience with exactly that pretension. His land art pieces were less a protest against the gallery system than they were a way to escape the tepidly middle-sized scale of most minimalist sculpture. In the absence of any sanction beyond our merely bodily existence, he was asking, how had we concluded that the scale of objects adjusted to our rather pathetic bodies could stand in for matter as such? How could it pose as diagnostic of the universe as mere sheer fact? And then there was a renewed confrontation with the Rothko Chapel, which was then relegated to the status of some kind of New Age kitsch. As part of a Getty Research Institute program on architecture and music, prompted by the opening of the new Disney Concert Hall, new at the time, Morton Feldman's amazing composition called Rothko Chapel, commissioned to be premiered in the space, was the key for me in returning to the deep origins of Rothko's last undertaking. When Feldman's work was performed inside the chapel, even if the event was brief, the population of its interior with both bodies and music can be said to have made the chapel whole, to have completed the work of dethroning the self-involvement entailed in the normal contemplation of singular, hyper-valued works of art. Hearing Feldman's music in the space, the softly rolling entrance of the timpani at the start of the piece and the floating emergent entrances of the wordless chorus reinforce the decentered, minimally perceptible, and aniconic figuration of Rothko's paintings, their dark cloud formations of depthless depth with which the Houston Chapel's walls are infused. The power that they exert over the many visitors surely arises from their ability to call on our awareness and fear of an unfathomable vastness of things, the necessary mystery that has replaced an ordered cosmos with a God presiding. And the final chapter and epilogue of the book on James Turrell and Sister Corita Kent, both signature Los Angeles artists, are, of course, embedded in the city, and both of them deservedly have been the focus of renewed recent attention, LACMA having given itself over to its epic Turrell retrospective, while local hero Michael Duncan and recent arrival Susan Dackerman have renewed for Corita some measure of the huge public fame that she enjoyed in the 1960s. But those eminently worthy projects haven't covered everything, which is where I hope No Idols comes in. Turrell's art is celebrated for engaging the senses, but there's another perspective on it to be derived from a Quaker suspicion of sensory enticements as idle vanity, especially an idolatrous attachment to artificial objects over the love of creation as the gift of our very being. And his work of the 1960s can perhaps be more deeply understood in that perspective than the ones that we have generally been offered. And Quaker detachment from worldly things has made the Society of Friends the denomination most committed to human improvement of this world. I really find it constantly astonishing that so few people in the art world are aware that Turrell spent months in prison during the mid-1960s, arising from a renewed commitment on his part to Quaker pacifism. He was entrapped by FBI agents while counseling young prospective conscientious objectors, sentenced to federal custody, where he spent, by his own account, a good portion of his sentence in solitary confinement. Now, many 60s artists would subsequently proclaim their generally cost-free opposition to the Vietnam War, but personal witnessing to compare to Turrell's has been distinctly rare. No Idols asks where it came from and the ways in which the character of his art in the 1960s followed from the same set of convictions. Corita Kent also conceived the deity as the fount of existence, but her practical understanding was very far from Turrell's. For her, the commercial images and slogans that she incorporated into her 1960s art followed from belief in divinity present in every life-giving manifestation of existence. The abundance on view in the supermarket right alongside the conventionally elevated notions of the religious sublime. So infinite mercy personified in the Virgin Mary for her was as evident in the heart-shaped tomato on a Del Monte label as it was on the most revered Renaissance Madonna. The Virgin Mary is the juiciest tomato of them all, as she inscribed on one of her best-known prints. A little corny, it might seem, in its cheerfulness, and surely nothing as bold or deeply provocative as Turrell's anti-draft activities, but not so to the Cardinal Archbishop McIntyre of the LA Archdiocese. That print in particular, exactly on account of its elevation of the lives of everyday parishioners, led him to suppress its distribution and forbid Corita from pursuing her public career as an artist. Not that she complied, but the confrontation with that reactionary pro-war cardinal drove her from her community of sisters and students, a loss few of us would be able to calculate. And her intransigence just got stronger. Both were political. Turrell in ways that remain largely unknown, Kent at the time famously so. But the character of witness in both cases show that the usual notions of the political in art are, by comparison, shallow and self-congratulatory. That is not driven by the theological necessity that in both of these cases encompasses the art as well as the acts. Thank you for your kind attention so far, but this is only the kind of second act of the evening, and I think Stephen and I will take our places in the center.
All right, we're situated. First, following Tom, I'd also like to thank Aram and Claudia and Jenny for all of their work and inviting us here and putting together all of the logistics. And I want to thank Tom for coming back to LA. It's great to have him here. And you're right, you don't come here enough. So
That's kind of
just
you to say.
well, it's true. But I'm a huge fan of this book, and when I was reading it, at first it took me back to my early days as a graduate student, which is now a long time ago, and your book, Painters in Public Life in 18th Century Paris. And for me, the delightful piece of many delightful pieces was seeing how you interweave these threads from the 1960s backwards to the 18th century and the late 17th century with Chardin. And that was an amazing beginning for me. I had not expected it. And I would love to hear you talk about the sort of how you set up the different ways you encounter religion in these works as kind of a longue durée.
Well, yes, I think that we're always in a longue durée, and the increased specialization of modern art studies has, obscured that for a lot of followers of art history, students in art history, our peers and colleagues in the field. But not that it's a naturally easy thing to do. The idea of the rupture or the break or the epistemic, divide has kind of captivated people's imaginations, and they like that idea, and authorities like Michel Foucault have encouraged it. But a lot of things persist in ways that we lose sight of. Often things that were powerful in the past don't go away, don't just vanish because a new phase or a new kind of dominant paradigm has arisen. They migrate, and they migrate to places where you don't quite expect them, or they don't seem to manifest the same vividness that they had in their past lives. And the section on Jansenism, and I won't go into a long explanation as to who the Jansenists were, but Pascal was one of them, and they were a very powerful countervoice within the Catholic Church at the time when, of course, Protestants were, seen as the great external enemy. Their critique was mounted in the name of the survival and flourishing of the one true church, but it was a vision of what comprehension of the sort of depth in the original idea of a Christian God, which had few of the trappings of splendor and iconographical attractiveness, with which it had been clothed by artists on the whole. But they didn't want to engage in iconoclasm. They weren't, they weren't like the radical Protestants in that regard. They wanted an art that would acknowledge its limitations, that would draw you in, but then make you think about the limits and the potential traps and vanities of art. So they like themes where, Christian heroes were found to be wanting. They loved the denial of Peter, for example. Or they loved the supper at Emmaus when the disciples cannot recognize the risen Christ. He just seems to be some stranger. Where the confidence one might have in sort of mastering the divine fails. And as I said, when I was teaching the seminar, I got more deeply into it and began to think what a perspective this gives you on religious art, that the normal kind of reasonable acceptance of credulous practices doesn't do, because that reasonable acceptance of credulous practices would kind of describe the normal way that art history deals with religious artifacts. And this was a way of making it mean something in a way that you could find in your own self and in your own life. I could keep going on, but I feel I'm giving another lecture, so we should give the mic back to you.
No, I love that you said that, though, because I was thinking about how you set up Jansenism in politically and in terms of its doctrine, but then you also take it, and this is where, again, Chaudin is so useful and valuable, to show how in the hands of that artist, all right, these principles affect the way that he works. And so it's not just he is exhibiting these principles, but the principles give him a kind of language through which he can change his art making. And you talk about the kinds of things he begins to paint and what he rejects, but also a kind of de-skilling, which you talked about with reference to the 1960s. And so that model becomes sort of relevant for you. And I didn't realize it until you were talking about Sister Corita Kent, where with the tomato, and sort of moving it to another context where you have these boundaries broken down between what we think of as the sacred and what we imagine to be the profane. And it's a really similar kind of operation, which I had not even been thinking about until you said that. And so you have, I think, religion and Jansenism becoming a kind of envelope for a set of different operations in the works of these different artists.
Yeah, I do think that many of the same things come back. And, if you take a different distance from your material, in talking about Mark Rothko, for example, in the book, the idea is advanced that he was exposed to some medieval, 11th century manuscript pages that had a very strong design, abstract quality, vivid contrasting colors that he began to experiment with in his own art in the 1940s, I think partly through the mediation of his friend, the medieval art historian Meyer Shapiro, and of course a very important early critic of contemporary art. And it's easy to see these as a sort of willful revival, or better to say quotation from the art of the past. But the fact is, the artists in the monastery of Silos that Shapiro wrote about, and whose work from that period was represented in the copies that Rothko would have been aware of, were copyists of a manuscript, the Beatus commentary on the Book of Revelation, that was already 300 years old. So Rothko comes along, 700 years later. It's a longer span of time, to be sure, but it's not completely incommensurable. It's within a line of copying and reinterpretation of something which is, immensely old, going back to the 8th century, really to the Dark Ages, which has managed to survive for a number of centuries in its heyday, and when it reappears in our own time, is it not in that lineage? That was one of the questions I was asking. And then Rothko, of course, turns it around and rejects the supernaturalist imagery and turns it into his early abstraction in ways that you can actually pinpoint step by step how he goes about this translation. So things survive often by being reversed, as well as just being mimicked, or replicated. And that was one of the principles I was interested in that particular chapter.
Yeah. Well, it's and I love how in that instance you describe, and I'm tempted to read it actually, the ways in which the religion comes to play with even with his edges, and you talk about the sort of the margins and the white of the canvas and how it's sort of breaking down and becoming unstable. When I was reading that, I was reading it against the grain of sort of thinking through the manuscripts and thinking through that earlier work and seeing how the practice, the formal practice, has been infused by his understanding of Shapiro and these other doctrines.
And really, taking it in his own hands.
Yeah.
And I don't want in any way to see it as being a sort of illustration of the work of an art historian, but the art historian was a phenomenal and exceptional one,
right.
And I think a great catalyst to him. But once the formal problems had been set in motion, they were, it just implicitly against idolatry, that is, against the investment of value and desire into artificially created simulacra.
Right.
And to find in art, art is mostly like that. That's mostly what art does.
Yeah.
But to find in art the contrary, or at least a vision beyond it, I think is how in the end we get to the Rothko Chapel, as I was trying to say, maybe in a slightly stilted manner in the remarks I made at the lectern. And it is a phenomenal place, and the fact that people are sitting around on cushions and reading Gurdjieff and so on shouldn't put you off it.
No, and you say something about that. You at a certain point ask, and you said, I'm going to sort of completely bastardize this, but you ask at a certain point how you ask about how we see and how we receive this, and it is along those lines of you leave the question hanging of whether or not we're getting it right, and the inference is that it doesn't matter, that that our engagement is our engagement.
And I think we're not always in a good position to be sure.
Right.
That the ability of art to point beyond what we can feel secure in knowing or understanding is, I think, its most profound function, and one that has been kind of lost to our regular sort of critical and art historical language. People are very afraid of the idea of the unknown and quickly relegate it to some devalued idea of mysticism, when mysticism exists for a reason. It exists because some of the most profound things that we can try to talk about can never be addressed directly or described directly. They can only be approached in an indirect manner and in a figurative manner, and often these figurative manners are fetishize themselves and become cult-like and so on, but it doesn't mean that they don't point back to something that validly, implicates all of us, I think.
But that makes me think, and we've talked a bit about this, about the notion of these kinds of things, mysticism or thinking about religion, or in the case of your book, Catholicism, really, as a kind of polemic when we start talking about modern and contemporary art, and I think particularly the 1960s, right? And coming in as an Africanist, as someone who has had to read a lot about masquerade, and I teach masquerade, and thinking about how that field of inquiry has been constructed, that in many ways the religious or the metaphysical or the theological has been considered as part and parcel of the work. That in understanding those stances, you start to get to some deeper understanding of what's going on, right? And so then moving, and I guess I'm odd in that I was also trained as a modernist. that, moving back and forth, suddenly I'm looking at a Rothko or a Turrell, and I am not supposed to have that response, right? That in the field, if we're saying that, we're starting to talk about the theological, and I'm sort of assuming that this is the intervention that your book is making, right? That we've somewhat suppressed these things in the interpretation and understanding of modern and contemporary art.
Yeah, and at the cost of, I think, some severe misunderstanding, among the kind of cognoscenti of process art and minimalism and so on, you won't hear Turrell spoken about with much respect, if he's spoken about at all, and relegated to being a kind of New Age figure when, of course, in his formation he was nothing like that, and his own religious tradition, very strongly embedded in his family, was of a far more steely and respectable character, and so it's led to people somehow not seeing what's right in front of their eyes. Like the prison sentence, for example, which every time I say it to somebody, even people who are very clued in, it comes as this big surprise. And looking at then his withdrawal from the art world, which was severe after he got out of prison and got his studio, in Ocean Park, where he just wouldn't have anything to do for a long time with any of the blandishments of the art world. I mean, he was very severe about it. And then he kind of withdrew a second time in a way that people also don't seem to have any idea about, as he went back to Claremont to finish his MFA. And it's very often said, that, in 66 he left Irvine because he was done being a student. He was going to be an artist. Well, first of all, he got sentenced to jail.
Oops.
And then not very long afterwards, he decided he was going to finish his MFA, just in a different program, and immersed himself in that amazing scene that was going on at Pomona and Claremont in those years, when Bastian Otter was there, and Louis Baltz was teaching there. I mean, Turrell was both teaching and completing his degree. And so there was all this going on, and he was in that period, though, almost unknown to the art world that had paid a lot of attention to him just a few years before. And then when the Pomona thing kind of collapsed for various reasons, then he decided, well, I'm going to get a grant and get a plane and go look for something out in the Southwest where I can make a work of art. and the rest is history. And it also changed his art, of course, because he had to finance the damn thing, and so he had to really relax a lot of the sort of uncompromising, aniconic kind of the principles that he'd followed in the 60s, which is why I stick to that period.
I was going to ask you about the period, because while taking out Chardin for a minute, while you look as far back as the 40s, the real focus is the 1960s. And do you think that there's something about the kind of narrative, the kind of opening up that you do with these works in that moment? Is there something particular to that moment, perhaps?
Well, there are privileged moments in history and in art history when more is going on than in other periods. It's just a way that the ebb and flow, nothing's ever going to be continuous and the same. And there are moments when there's some kind of collective realization that the former packages in which art was presented were no longer useful, and new ones had to be made. The late 17th century in France is one of those times when what a proper painting would be was still sort of up for grabs, and what the academy would sponsor. At the same time, that what a proper garden would be, or a proper, this is in France, what a ballet would be, what an opera would be. And all of these things were in a state of flux and a process of formation. And I feel, as an historian, I want to make my job more interesting. So I'd look for those kinds of moments. Aram mentioned the forthcoming book about art around the time of the fall of Napoleon, which I think, condensed a lot of historical events into a very short time, and art, had to adapt more rapidly than it had to do for quite a while, and some things flourished, some things failed, and so there's a lot going on. And I think the 1960s for us is even though it's a half century in the past already, represents that in a way that we haven't quite experienced yet. There were some moments right around 1980. Maybe it's going on now, and I'm unaware of it. But there's enough distance, and we have these astonishing figures like Smithson, who don't come along all the time.
Right.
We were talking last night, actually, Stephen and I was reflecting on the 70s as this time when three artists, Eva Hesse in 1970, Bob Smithson in 1973, and Gordon Motta Clark in 1978 were suddenly, at young ages, snatched out of the system. And that was the opposite of what I've been trying to describe. That was a depletion of irreplaceable talent that I think we're still living with just by happenstance, because history is so much driven by those kinds of accidental events.
Right. And we're also, as we talked about too, living with their legacies, right? And that their legacies are likely greater than we realize, and that when one starts looking and really parsing through what later artists have been looking at, so often it's Smithson pops up everywhere.
Yeah, he's upstairs.
Yeah,
that pedestal in the sand. I mean,
yes. And he pops up where you don't imagine he will pop up. So in artists of color, he's big. And so it is that interesting. But the question that you had asked was, what if they had lived? And we couldn't imagine it. We just couldn't do it.
And both Smithson and Motta Clark, at least, have sides to them that are easily, sort of hived off and dismissed as metaphysical or mystical. And I wrote a little book about Motta Clark too, and tried to bring those elements back together. I wasn't thinking then quite of the deeper theological arguments and the critique of idolatry, which I think is at the heart of a plausible or respectable kind of theology as far as art is concerned.
Yes.
But I think that maybe it was a staging ground for it.
Well, even with Smithson, I mean, I love how you describe him as his own theologian, and if you chart how the early works, and the sort of principles that he's wrestling with in the earlier works start to become suffused into the later works. That they don't actually go away. But they just manifest
not at all.
differently.
There was a reason why he put the spiral jetty in a kind of stagnant inlet of the Great Salt Lake that turned red periodically because of these microcrustaceans in the water, because he was still kind of saturated with this Eucharistic imagery. And the idea of something being both material and immaterial at the same time, which is what he wanted to assert, doesn't have a lot of correlatives in the culture, or anyway, none nearly as strong as the sacramental logic of Holy Communion. And so he never dropped that from the beginning of his career till the very end. And a lot of his characteristic symbology, like the spiral itself, in his mind had some strong connection with this doubleness, this sacramental logic that he saw in his own version of Catholicism. And it allowed him even to, incorporate figures like Nabokov and Beckett, into, Catholic, cosmic imaginings.
Right. And they fit into the labyrinth. They fit in, and they, and it comes back to this notion, and a Jansenist notion, right, of so breaking down boundaries. That was my takeaway, in a way that they were breaking down boundaries between things that we thought were separate, and in thinking back to the 1960s. You have that sort of thing happening. You have it, and you describe beautifully how it happened in the late 17th century, and you have these moments where things start to coalesce and fertilize in different ways, and in a sense, at least with the artists that you're choosing to look at here, you have it happening in their work, right? And so it's about it's about social categories, sure, but it's also about mediums, and it's also about, as you mentioned last night, light, right, and the uses of these things too.
Yeah, it's light is malleable and instantaneous, and in some ways, logically the opposite to the fixed form of works of art. But of course, it's hard to incorporate light in that sense into the work without freezing it and giving it a contrary fixity, which is not in its nature. But I think that Rothko again in the suffused, very muted luminosity of the big panels in the chapel achieves something like that. The art of Colin McCahon, the one artist that most people in North America will not have heard of, but is the center chapter for a reason. An immensely powerful and important artist who saw, texts from the Bible and theological ideas as central to his work without ever giving himself over to their dogmatic character, and held that line in part because of his finding an idiom where the appearance of the words from the Gospel of John would be like a luminous interruption of the darkness. Right. And I can say that, and it sounds a little bit portentous, but when you see the works, he did it. He actually did it, and sadly, they're they can't be seen in the Northern Hemisphere. They're all in Australia and New Zealand, and it's therefore becomes a kind of special experience that is really treasured there, but doesn't travel. But the other thing was I was thinking about all of them. Really, there's a way in which there's a metamorphosis in the work, not just development, but an actual transposition and reversal or upending of an initial assumption to a later state, which still contains the initial assumption in it, but seems the reverse. Certainly Smithson's agonized expressionistic Christ figures from 1961 don't look anything like the spiral jetty, unless you sort of notice that there are a lot of little spirals in those figures. But they seem to be in utterly different idioms of art. But by his own mental processes, the one is the is the greater fullness or redemption of the earlier. And I don't think Rothko is far from that. I know McCahon can be seen in that respect. And Corita herself had to change radically in her personal witnessing against the really, unhealthy and unchristian views of her own archbishop.
Right.
And to, in a way, try to make God speak through her prince as a contradiction of the archbishop. As the delivery of a judgment on his profound limitation. So that's a pretty astonishing thing to undertake for a cloistered nun.
Oh, absolutely, and it's it gets towards speaking in tongues too, which is which you can see other artists claiming to do, and they run up against the paradigm of your book because they're not sort of. They're idolatrous. They're and very like the Renaissance, right? And very explicitly so. And so I think that on that level, your book allows us to understand that this is one form of sort of dealing with the theological or with Catholicism. And then that there are these other ways too that perhaps we can start to think about that are really just sort of radically different, but contemporaneous with these other things that are happening.
Well, I'm thinking too, and I am, I gratefully acknowledge that there are certain really strong thinkers and writers who mostly come out of modern Catholic allegiance. The philosophers Mark Johnston and Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor's Secular Age is something I think that everyone should read. And I think actually Mark Johnston's slim little Saving God, Religion After Idolatry would be a book I would recommend to everyone. And the very polemical David Bentley Hart is, I think a valuable contributor to our discussions right now. But all of this is going on without really much cognizance from within the study of art. That's right. Even though, if you look globally at what art historians study, 95% of it is religiously motivated.
Right. And so we want to.
So in a way, the very thing that we're responsible for has had to be denatured in order to fit into this kind of secularized rationality, which is sort of blinkered apprehension of it.
Yes, or into our definitions of rigor, because we run into that problem, right? If we start talking about the metaphysical, suddenly we're not serious. And so I think that your book really sort of, and I think very discreetly, very, very diplomatically, comes up against that as well. I mean, I keep thinking of your series, right? The series that it comes out of, Empower Polemics, right? And one asks, well, what is the polemic? And I think that in a way, the work, because I think you describe your book as a slim volume, and I think that it's a small, big book, right? That the idea.
Well, I hope so, and it's kind of you to say so. The importance of a book is not based on its curb weight.
Right. I did weigh a book once in a review, though, but it was 10 pounds. What you infer and what you start to think about is how we have suppressed the religious and how we sort of eschew it. We can talk about religious art without ever mentioning religion, unless we're doing a dutiful iconography of the peeled lemon or Christ or this or
liturgy. That came
to
be a very big thing because you just describe people marching around or doing one thing or another, which was, perfectly empirical in character. And so that took the fore for a while.
Right. Or even in reception, we don't think about, say, the Eucharist or the, or transmorphic, I'm not going to get the word right.
Transubstantiation.
Transubstantiation, thank you. And those things, we don't take them seriously. And in this book, you do. And it's not just the sort of Catholic function of it, but how it registers as an operation, as a way to sort of, come to a new language of art making. And
which may be the
huge.
Recovery of some old languages that
Exactly.
have migrated to places where we don't recognize them any longer, and they're still available. As I say, that this modern theological argument that you can find in books from respected university presses and so on, could be something we use when we're talking about overtly devotional or religious art, or this kind of religion against the grain, which is the case, I think, in the artists that I've chosen to emphasize. That doctrinal orthodoxy is in none of these cases what they're about.
Right.
And the assumption that religious art will be primarily about doctrinal orthodoxy is the big mistake, and it's the mistake that comes from just privileging without thinking the idea of a supposedly scientific, merely material rationality, and also the mistaken assumption that the most profound things about art are susceptible to direct description, which they wouldn't be, or they wouldn't be profound.
Right. It's an amazing. I challenge all of you. I invite all of you to pick up a copy of Tom's book. It's an amazing read. You'll learn a lot, and you'll think about new ways in which we can understand the art of our time and the art of the mid-20th century. I think that this is a good moment to turn to the audience and see if anyone in the audience would like to ask Tom a question.
I'd be very happy if you did.
Yeah, and if you can wait for someone to come with a mic, that would be even better.
Tom, I know your book is sort of primarily historic and then into the 60s and so forth. But as a working artist today who received my training 30 years ago with Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe and Stephen Prina as my mentors, I was really amazed at how spiritual, I don't like the word spiritual, but sacramental or sacred reference in artwork that might take you beyond the material was really denied students. I mean, it was almost, not personally those two only, but the whole system of learning art history and then developing your practice. It was assumed that this would be a lightweight, beyond the pale sort of move to reference this sort of thing beyond the physicality and the materiality of the artwork. And even more recently, something like the religious art of Andy Warhol. And looking at him in those eyes, especially toward the end of his career and that last suite of paintings that he did, those types of observations were just not recognized as being rigorous enough to. So what I'm getting at is I so appreciate what you're what you've done, that someone of your stature would address this subject.
Well, obviously, thank you very much for those remarks, which are very gratifying. And when you bring up Warhol and Warhol's, move toward, reproducing traditional religious motifs like the Last Supper in his work, and the fact that he was a dutiful Catholic, raised one, and so on. And there is, quite a useful book by Eleanor Hartney about artists who fall into that category of being dutiful in their religious observance and, in some way investing their art with that. But I'd have to say that's just not what I'm interested in. It's a kind of observation of their behavior and practices in the same way that you would look at the congregants in a Florentine church and see the ex voto that they left on this particular image and how many more some other image got, and you created a little sociological picture of the way people were behaving in this environment, and then looked at the imagery for some clues as to, what stimulated it and so on, which is all excellent historical work to do, but it doesn't get to this fundamental, question of, something cannot come from nothing, and therefore a strictly material logic cannot account for the fact that there is material, that might possess a logic, and there's a next level of some comprehension of the framework in which material logic exists. David Bentley Hart calls it supranatural or hypernatural, to stay away from supernaturalism, that is, from the irrational and the normally manipulative and rather demeaned kinds of beliefs that art often traffics in. But there could be something that had the sort of depth that everybody's looking for. Just as a last point, the big problem of abstract art is the problem of depth. Because once you get rid of recognizable, stories and symbols and so on, then what is going to make the art, anchored and profound in human life? And it's hard to find. And that's where I think these particular artists, excelled, or had that understanding of what the problem was in the first place, which not everyone, maybe as you're saying, in the climate of opinion where you were trained, people didn't even know that was the problem. There was a question.
Mr. Crow, the book No Idols presents two models for addressing theology, Christian theology, within Western art. The first one, abstract, non-image, non-sight work by secular artists, which is read as having to do with theology. And then second, representational work in image and text by artists who step out of their congregation. Do you have any thoughts on a third model, the devout Christian artist in a contemporary art context?
Do we have some good examples of that? Or is it a possibility that would, I don't know, it's a counterfactual or a hypothetical in some way, because a lot of go to the LA Cathedral and ask if this is adequate, if those images along the walls of the interior are adequate. There is one of the things that Corita was really motivated by was the idea that conventional religious art, even if very competently executed, she called it the last unflowering of the Renaissance. She just saw it as the thing that made her art necessary, and it would be far more abstracting. It would be often difficult to decipher because she would make her texts, kind of distorted, and that she would use all the resources of contemporary art in abstraction, pop imagery, and so on, to find another. She was, a sister in the order devoted to the Virgin of the Sacred Heart, and suddenly when you look at the tomato, is there a motif that resembles in size and shape and color the human heart more exactly than a tomato does? And that's exactly what she put in place of these cloying and corny virgins, from the 19th century that she wanted to replace. And no one, I would say, was as profoundly committed to Christian belief, or more profoundly committed to Christian belief than she was. But her route to making that persuasive passed through secular art, that passed through the kind of art that was valid on other terms, and inflected it in the way that she felt was necessary. That's what we can observe. That is just another possible case. It's hard for me to imagine, but that's just probably my limitation. Yes, in the middle, there's a question.
Thank you so much. It's really a privilege, to listen to this. I have a gallery in Mexico City. We've been curating a series of exhibits for the last 2 years. We're in a transitional period right now. I live here in LA. I'm into also film production, and what has always fascinated me, kind of like working with great artists, in Mexico City, kind of figuring out who we're going to exhibit, is that we're immersed, and this is what this lecture has brought to consciousness right now. This is more of a comment than a question. Because being in Mexico City, it's very heavy, the historical weight of every street you walk through, every piece of architecture and the correlation between the architectural styles and even the names of the streets. Mm. And then you go back 3,000 years, and all the relationship and the kind of like the gain of meaning and the loss of meaning, mystical, religious, cultural, at all levels. But when we get to the actual exhibits, it's we've exhibited a couple of artists that worked with light and reflection, and they were very popular. Not in the sense that popular that it had like a lot of effect, but people connected with them, and that always seemed to me very interesting. And me too. His name is Alejandro Fournier. And he works with this kind of like reflections of reflections, and I think he's a very important Mexican artist because of that. That he kind of like brings us back to this mystical experience, and is related on the outside to the heavy, really like the religious aspect of Mexico City and just Mexican culture and. In general, I kind of like to end my comment because this, like I was saying before, is brought to consciousness things that were unconscious before, kind of like hearing your lecture. Right now, we're working on a documentary, and the director that we chose for this documentary, he's very Catholic, and it's about the migration of French migrants that ended up in Veracruz in Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico. That's where I'm from, and established a colony of migrants. It's about that relationship.
Like after 1685, would that have been?
It was
when they were expelled from
1830.
France? Oh, okay.
There was a famine in France, and they they were tricked into going to Mexico. Sometimes that's the story in itself. But this morning we were talking about the film, and I was surprised because he's very Catholic, very, very faith oriented, and I invited him because there's a lot. I mean, the first migration had a lot of priests into Mexico and the whole iconography. So I said, well, he's the right director. I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I wouldn't imagine this film being directed by any other. He has to be Catholic, for me. And then this morning he was talking to me about the light. Again, it's like, yeah, I want to make a film of the contrast between the light in the tropics, in the Mexican tropics, and the light in the Swiss French Alps, which is kind of where this originated. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. that you're talking is like Turrell, a little bit, like you were mentioning, that they go to this almost primal aspect of where all art kind of like originates. Thank you so much.
And then it's the kind of solvent, that would destroy art if you let the light have its way, and that doubleness, I think, is the very difficult thing to capture. Of course, I didn't get around to just saying, well, Jim Turrell just said I'm going to make my art out of light, so it wouldn't have any material character. And that was a very, very principled decision on his part. We can work back from that, almost limit position to the ways that light can be handled in more conventional techniques, but still gives it its contrariness in relation to the frozen, the congealed, the inanimate. And it's neither of those qualities. It's the way that they are made to coexist, I think, that gives the art some profound grasp on this bigger reality beyond the strictly logical, material, it's getting late in the day, and I'm missing the word I want here, but I think you've heard me say it already.
Time for one more question, or two more questions?
We could do both of them.
Okay.
One there and one there. Okay.
Thank you. That was really great. I'm curious, excuse me, your case studies begin with Rothko being sort of the earliest artist that you talk about in the book. And I'm wondering why you began with Rothko and not why earlier, thinking about someone like Linda Dalrymple Henderson's work on sort of the fourth dimension and kind of thinking about utopian ideas and people like Pete Mondrian or de Stijl. I think it's a little bit different what you're doing, of course, but I'm just kind of wondering why you began when you did begin.
Well, that was very conscious. Of course, Rothko isn't the first. Chardin, an artist, from 200 years earlier, are first in the book. And then there is a kind of rapid fast forward, to get to Rothko. But I wasn't interested in worked out metaphysical systems. I was interested in things that arose from confrontation with intransigent, contradictions within the work based on a dissatisfaction with, the capacities of the mind to delineate, to limit, to describe, because the thing about, these various systems with which artists like Mondrian and Kandinsky and so on were enamored is that they were really, worked out in detail rather than pointing towards the unknown that we could, via artistic instruments come at least to incorporate into our consciousness in ways that would recognize the limits of our abilities to describe the, what lies outside the strictly material. And I'm not sure that those, systems from those mystical systems from the early 20th century really qualify in that regard. And I wanted, the book couldn't be that long, and it was arising from, a connection, I guess I felt, with those particular artists, and a certain convergence on the period, as Stephen was emphasizing. Rothko had found his form before the 1960s, but it really was, that was a period he worked through and during which he changed. That was really the last metamorphosis occurred in the 60s, and so did these other artists converge around it. And so it had a kind of coherence. I mean, there probably could be a much bigger book here with lots more figures in it, but I'm not sure that it would have helped, It helped establish the point. And, if anybody wants to do it, obviously I would be the most, gratified by their doing so. But I guess those are the reasons.
Thank you very much. Just a brief question. In terms of Smithson, how much do you see his interest in this as sort of modified by a paradoxical kind of mock heroism, something like the films of the large trucks that seems a little bit overblown, and as if he's asking that his embrace of this is there's a certain question as to how serious he is or not.
I'd say he's pretty serious. Maybe one way of addressing your question is his hyper-consciousness of his peers and what was going on in the art world at the time. That's what induced him to drop his figurative painting, because he recognized that there wouldn't be any future for him. He wouldn't get any traction in the art world if he stuck with it. And he developed a fantastic talent for a kind of mimicry of what artists around him were doing, like Judd in particular. And then you had this sort of heroic style of a Richard Serra, for example, who to this day will tell you about how much he contributed to the building of the Spiral Jetty, like almost like he'd done it, And Smithson, and of course Michael Heiser has this, this endless kind of vendetta against Smithson in death. You're still alive, at least. It was a hyper-competitive, obviously very kind of masculine and physical, ethos of the time. And he wasn't going to give anything away to anybody. He was going to show he could handle that sort of imagery, self-imagery that was going, but he would turn it to his own account, and I think back to the things that always mattered to him would be my way of reading it.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Tom, for your wonderful book and your wonderful presentation.
I couldn't be more grateful, Stephen, to you for, agreeing to engage in this conversation, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you all for being here.